On a quiet Sunday evening in a small Ohio town, Margaret Wilson folded laundry in her living room, the TV murmuring an old rerun she wasn't watching. At 68, she had learned how to live with silence. Silence was safer than hope. When the knock came, it startled her so badly, she dropped a towel. No one ever knocked on Margaret's door anymore. She moved slowly, joints aching, heart thudding with a strange fear she couldn't explain. Through the thin glass, she saw the outline of a tall man standing on her porch. Military posture, broad shoulders. Still as stone. She opened the door. The towel slipped from her hands. "Mom?" The man said softly.
Mom?
Margaret's knees buckled. Her breath vanished. The world tilted. She had buried her son 12 years ago. The last normal morning of Margaret Wilson's life began with coffee growing cold on the kitchen counter. Daniel stood near the door in his uniform, duffel bag at his feet, sunlight catching the edge of the medals on his chest. He looked older than his 27 years, like someone who had already seen too much of the world, but when he smiled at his mother, he was still the boy who used to run through this house in muddy shoes. "You packed too much," Margaret said, trying to sound casual as she straightened his collar for the third time. Daniel chuckled. "You always say that." She wanted to say don't go. Instead, she handed him a paper bag. "Your favorite sandwiches, in case the food over there is terrible." He hugged her tightly. "I'll be back before you know it." At the airport, Margaret stood behind the glass long after Daniel disappeared into the crowd of soldiers. Something in her chest felt heavy, like a warning she didn't know how to read. 6 months later, the knock came. 2 officers stood on her porch in full dress uniform. Margaret knew before they spoke. Every military mother knew. Her ears rang as they talked. Words blurred together: ambush, classified mission, no remains recovered. One of the officers handed her a folded American flag. It felt heavier than it should have. Margaret's knees gave out. She slid to the floor, clutching the flag like it was the last piece of her son. The world ended quietly. In the weeks that followed, casseroles filled her fridge. Cards stacked on the table. People spoke in whispers, as if grief were contagious. The Army declared Captain Daniel Wilson killed in action. There was no body to bury. At the memorial service, Margaret sat in the front row, staring at Daniel's photograph, his confident smile frozen in time. When his name was read aloud, she felt something tear inside her that never fully healed. After the crowd left, she stayed behind, touching the cold stone where his name was engraved. "I should have hugged you longer," she whispered. Daniel's bedroom remained untouched. His jacket still hung behind the door. Margaret couldn't bring herself to wash the faint scent of his cologne from it. Nights were the worst. She'd wake up reaching for a phone that never rang, listening to the house breathe around her. People told her she was strong, but strength, Margaret learned, was simply surviving each day without screaming. Daniel hadn't died the day the explosion tore through the convoy, even though the world believed he had. The blast came without warning, a wall of fire and metal that lifted the armored vehicle off the ground and hurled it into chaos. Daniel remembered the sound first, a violent roar that swallowed every other thought, then the weightlessness as his body was thrown clear, tumbling down a rocky ravine like a broken piece of equipment. When he finally stopped moving, pain flooded in from every direction, sharp and overwhelming, stealing his breath and his consciousness. He woke up days later, beneath a sky that wasn't familiar, the sun harsh and unforgiving. His body felt shattered. Shrapnel was embedded near his spine, his leg burned and torn, his head throbbing with a deep, frightening emptiness. He couldn't remember his unit's call sign. He couldn't remember the exact coordinates of the mission. For hours, he couldn't even remember his own name. Local villagers found him barely alive and carried him to a hidden shelter carved into the hills. They didn't know if he was friend or enemy, only that he was human and bleeding. Medical care was improvised and dangerous, but it saved his life. During fevered nights, Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by fragments of memory, his mother's kitchen, the smell of coffee, the sound of her voice, calling him for dinner. Those memories anchored him when everything else felt lost. Weeks later, when his mind finally cleared, the truth began to surface. His unit had been operating under a classified directive. The mission officially never existed. When the convoy was destroyed, Command made a decision that would alter Daniel's life forever. To protect intelligence assets and ongoing operations, the soldiers involved were declared dead. No recovery. No follow-up. No questions. When Daniel was discreetly contacted by representatives from the shadows of the military world, he was given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. He could attempt to re-enter a life that, on paper, no longer belonged to him, risking exposure and putting others in danger, or he could disappear completely, continuing to serve in operations that required anonymity and sacrifice beyond recognition. Daniel thought of his mother, of the promise he'd made at the airport, of the way her hands had trembled when she hugged him goodbye. He chose silence. Recovery was brutal. Physical therapy pushed his body to its limits. Nights were filled with pain and memories he wasn't allowed to share. His name was stripped away, replaced with numbers and code words. He became a soldier without a past, moving between locations that never appeared on maps, completing missions that would never be acknowledged. Years passed measured not in birthdays or holidays, but in deployments and scars. Daniel watched the world change from a distance. He learned to live without phone calls, without photographs, without proof that he existed. On the rare quiet nights, he allowed himself one forbidden ritual. He would imagine his mother sitting alone in their living room, folding laundry, waiting for a door that would never open. The thought cut deeper than any wound. There were moments he nearly broke. Once, after a mission went wrong and a teammate didn't make it back, Daniel sat alone staring at his hands, wondering if his mother believed heaven had taken him whole or broken. Another time, while passing through an American base under a false identity, he overheard soldiers joking about home, about moms who worried too much. Daniel walked away before they could see the tears in his eyes. The hardest part wasn't the danger. It was the erasure. To be alive, breathing, fighting and still be considered dead by the person who loved him most. 12 years slipped by like a slow, relentless tide. Then one evening, a sealed envelope was placed on a metal desk in a dimly lit room. Daniel recognized the markings immediately. He opened it with steady hands. Operation concluded. Status cleared. Identity release authorized. For a long time, he simply sat there, staring at the words as if they might vanish. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with something he hadn't felt in over a decade. Hope. For the first time since the explosion, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't hidden. A future with a front door, a name, and a mother who might still be waiting. He packed lightly. There was nothing from the past 12 years he wanted to carry with him. As the plane lifted off American soil, Daniel closed his eyes and whispered a single promise into the quiet cabin. Asterisk, I'm coming home. Mom. Asterisk, when the last guest left the memorial service and the folding chairs were stacked away, Margaret Wilson returned to a house that no longer felt like a home. The silence greeted her first, thick and unmoving, like air before a storm that never breaks. She placed the folded flag on the mantel with trembling hands and stood there for a long time, staring at it as if it might suddenly explain how a mother was supposed to keep breathing after burying her child without a body. Asterisk, the first year was survival. Margaret woke up every morning because the sun demanded it, not because she wanted to. She made coffee she barely drank and cooked meals she barely touched. Friends called often at first. They checked in, offered help, repeated the same careful sentences, meant to comfort, but never quite reaching her heart. Slowly, as weeks turned into months, the calls became fewer. Life moved on for everyone else. Margaret's did not. Daniel's bedroom became a shrine frozen in time. His boots sat neatly by the door, still dusty from his last leave. His childhood trophies lined the shelves beside his military plaques, proof of a life that had once been loud and full. Margaret dusted the room every week, careful not to disturb anything. She would sometimes sit on his bed, holding one of his old T-shirts to her chest, breathing in a scent that was fading faster than she was ready to accept. Asterisk at night. Grief came in waves. Some nights it whispered, letting her sleep a few hours before waking her with memories. Other nights it screamed. She would jolt awake, convinced she'd heard Daniel's voice calling her name, only to realize it was the house settling or the wind brushing against the windows. Those were the nights she cried into her pillow so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Asterisk holidays were the hardest. On Thanksgiving, Margaret still cooked Daniel's favorite dishes, even though no one else noticed. She set an extra place at the table the first year, then quietly stopped when the sight of it became unbearable. On Christmas mornings, she wrapped a small gift for him out of habit before remembering there was no one to open it. She donated those gifts anonymously, telling herself maybe some other mother would see her son smile because of it. Asterisk birthdays hurt in a different way. Each passing year reminded her that Daniel was aging somewhere in her memory, but nowhere in reality. She baked a cake every June, lit a single candle, and whispered, "Happy birthday, my son," before blowing it out alone. Asterisk people told Margaret she needed to let go. They said Daniel wouldn't want her to live this way. She nodded politely and thanked them, but inside she felt a quiet anger rise. Let go of what? Of a child she carried for 9 months? Of a love that didn't disappear just because the army said he was gone? Waiting, she realized, was the last thing she had left. Asterisk years passed, leaving their marks on her face and hands. Her hair turned silver. Her steps slowed. But every morning, Margaret opened the curtains and looked down the street, just in case. She told herself it was a habit, nothing more. Deep down, it was hope fragile, stubborn, and unkillable. Asterisk, the neighbors noticed. Some found it heartbreaking, others strange. Children who once waved at her grew up and moved away. New families moved in, unaware of the woman who checked her mailbox twice a day, who jumped slightly at every unexpected knock. Margaret didn't mind. She had learned how to live inside her own quiet rituals. Asterisk every Sunday, she visited the memorial where Daniel's name was etched in stone. She traced the letters with her fingers, memorizing their shape. They got it wrong. She would whisper when no one was around, "I know my son." It wasn't denial. It was intuition, the kind only a mother understands. Asterisk sometimes doubt crept in late at night, whispering cruel questions. What if she was wrong? What if Daniel really was gone, and her waiting was just another form of pain? On those nights, Margaret prayed not for miracles, but for strength. If waiting was her burden, she would carry it with dignity. Asterisk, as the years stretched on, Margaret found small ways to give her grief purpose. She volunteered at the local Veterans Center, helping other families navigate loss. She listened more than she spoke, offering quiet understanding instead of empty comfort. Other mothers saw themselves in her eyes. They didn't know how she did it. Margaret didn't either. Every so often, she dreamed of Daniel. In those dreams, he was always walking toward her, never running, never rushing, as if he had all the time in the world. She would wake up with tears on her cheeks and a strange calm in her chest. Those dreams sustained her more than sleep ever could. Asterisk, on warm evenings, Margaret sat on her porch, rocking slowly, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She imagined Daniel somewhere under that same sky. She spoke to him out loud, telling him about her day, about the small things no one else would care about. It made her feel less alone. 12 years after the day, the officer stood on her porch. Margaret folded laundry in the living room, the television murmuring in the background. It was an ordinary moment, painfully ordinary, just like so many others she had endured. Then came the knock. For a brief second, her heart froze. Something inside her whispered that this knock was different. She stood slowly, smoothing her sweater, telling herself not to be foolish. Hope had hurt her before. But she walked to the door anyway, because she always had. The envelope arrived without ceremony. Slipped under the door of a secure office Daniel had worked in for years under a name that was never his. It was thick, sealed, marked with codes he recognized instantly. For a moment, he didn't touch it. In his world, envelopes like that usually meant another mission, another goodbye to a life that wasn't real. This one felt different. When Daniel finally opened it, his eyes moved slowly across the page, absorbing words he had waited 12 years to see. Operation concluded. Status cleared. Identity release authorized. The letters blurred as his vision filled with tears he hadn't allowed himself in over a decade. His hands, steady through firefights and chaos, trembled. He sat back in his chair and let the truth settle. The war that had erased him was finally over. For hours, Daniel did nothing. He replayed memories he'd kept locked away, the airport hug, his mother's voice, the way she always watched from the doorway until he was completely gone. He wondered if she was still alive, if time had been kind or cruel. Fear crept in quietly. What if he was too late? That night, Daniel packed with care, though there was little to take. A few clothes. A worn photograph he had carried secretly for years, edges frayed from being unfolded too many times. His mother's face smiled up at him, frozen in a moment before grief claimed her. The journey home felt unreal. Every mile brought him closer to a life he had been forced to abandon. At the airport, surrounded by families reuniting, Daniel stood apart, watching embraces that once felt impossible to him. He wondered how many times Margaret had imagined this moment, and how many times she had forced herself not to. When he landed in Ohio, the air felt familiar, grounding. He rented a car and drove slowly through streets he knew by heart. Stores had changed. Trees were taller, but the rhythm of the town remained, like a song he hadn't heard in years, but still knew every word to. Daniel parked down the street from his childhood home. He needed a moment. From a distance, the house looked smaller than he remembered, quieter. The porch light was off, curtains drawn. He wondered if she still lived there, or if time had finally convinced her to leave. He walked toward the house, each step heavier than the last. Doubt clawed at him. What if she didn't recognize him? What if seeing him reopened wounds she had barely learned to survive? Daniel raised his hand and knocked. Inside, Margaret froze. The sound cut through her like lightning. She stood slowly, heart pounding, every instinct screaming not to hope. She had been disappointed before salesmen, neighbors. Wrong doors, but something about this knock felt deliberate. Familiar. She opened the door. Time seemed to stop. Daniel stood there in civilian clothes, hair touched with gray, eyes older, but unmistakably hers. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The world held its breath. Mom? Daniel said, his voice barely steady. The word shattered 12 years of silence. Margaret reached out, afraid he might disappear. When her fingers touched his face, warm and real, a sound tore from her chest, half sob, half prayer answered. Her legs gave out, And Daniel caught her just in time. Asterisk, I'm here, he whispered, holding her as if letting go might undo everything. I'm really here. Asterisk, they stood in the doorway, clinging to each other while years of grief dissolved into tears. The house that had known only waiting finally knew relief. Asterisk inside. Margaret made tea with shaking hands while Daniel sat at the kitchen table where he had once done homework. She touched his arm again and again, as if reassuring herself he wasn't a dream. They spoke in fragments at first, laughter and tears tangled together. Asterisk, I knew, she said finally. I never stopped knowing. Asterisk, Daniel bowed his head. I'm sorry I took so long. Asterisk, she cupped his face. You came back. That's all that matters. Asterisk outside. The porch light flickered on automatically as night settled in, no longer a signal of waiting, but a quiet celebration of a promise finally kept. Asterisk, for several minutes after the door closed behind them, neither Margaret nor Daniel spoke. Words felt too small for what was happening. They stood in the narrow hallway, arms wrapped around each other, breathing in proof of life. Margaret pressed her cheek against Daniel's chest, listening to his heartbeat like a sacred sound she had been denied for 12 long years. Asterisk, you're real, she whispered again and again, her fingers gripping the fabric of his jacket as if the slightest loosening might make him disappear. You're really here. Asterisk, Daniel tightened his hold, eyes closed, letting himself feel something he had never allowed on any battlefield safety. I'm not going anywhere, he said softly. I promise. Asterisk, they moved slowly into the living room, the same room where Margaret had spent countless evenings staring at the door, imagining this moment and forcing herself not to believe in it. Daniel looked around, his throat tightening. Everything was familiar and different at the same time. The couch had been replaced. The walls held more photographs now, most of them of him, uniformed, smiling, frozen in a past that had nearly become permanent. Asterisk, Margaret noticed his gaze. I didn't know how else to keep you close, she said apologetically. Asterisk, Daniel crossed the room and touched one of the frames. You did, he said. You never let me go. Asterisk, they sat together, knees touching, hands still linked. Margaret asked questions she'd rehearsed in her mind for years, then forgot them all, overwhelmed by the simple joy of hearing his voice answer back. Daniel told her only what he could, careful not to burden her with details meant to stay buried. What mattered wasn't where he had been, it was that he was home. Asterisk, Margaret suddenly laughed through her tears, a sound so unexpected it surprised them both. You missed my cooking, she said, wiping her cheeks. 12 years of it. Asterisk, Daniel smiled, the familiar crooked smile she knew by heart. Then I owe you 12 dinners. Asterisk, she insisted on making tea, hands still shaking as she moved around the kitchen. Daniel followed her, watching every small movement, every ordinary detail he had carried in memory for more than a decade. The ticking clock, the chipped mug she refused to throw away. Home wasn't a place, it was these moments. Asterisk, they talked deep into the night. Margaret told him about the years he missed, the neighbors who moved away, the friends who passed on, the way time had changed everything except her love for him. Daniel listened, guilt and gratitude wrestling inside him. When she spoke of the memorial, of tracing his name in stone, his eyes filled. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Margaret reached across the table and took his hands. Don't be. Whatever kept you alive was worth it. Asterisk, later, Margaret led him to his old bedroom. She opened the door slowly, almost reverently. Daniel stopped in the doorway, breath-catching. Nothing had changed. The bedspread, the shelves, his boots. You kept it, he whispered. I was waiting, she said simply. Asterisk, Daniel stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by a grief he could finally release. Margaret sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder, just like she used to when he was a boy. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Asterisk as dawn approached, light crept through the curtains, touching the room with a softness that felt like forgiveness. Margaret brewed fresh coffee, while Daniel stood at the window, watching the street wake up. A mail truck passed. A dog barked. Life continued, and for the first time in 12 years, he was part of it. Asterisk, when Daniel turned back to his mother, she was watching him with quiet awe, as if afraid blinking might undo everything. He crossed the room and hugged her again, longer this time. Asterisk, we have time now, he said. All the time we lost. Asterisk Margaret nodded, tears slipping down her face, but her smile was steady. I always believed that. Asterisk outside, the morning sun rose fully, flooding the house with light. The waiting was over. The reunion wasn't just a moment, it was a beginning. Asterisk healing did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, in small moments that slowly stitched together what 12 years of absence had torn apart. The morning after Daniel came home, Margaret woke early out of habit, her body still trained by years of loneliness. For a brief, terrifying second, she forgot. Then she heard movement in the kitchen, the clink of a cup, the soft hum of someone breathing, and her heart nearly burst. Asterisk Daniel stood at the counter, barefoot, making coffee the way he remembered she liked it. When he turned and saw her, he smiled like a boy caught doing something right. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by how ordinary and miraculous the sight was at the same time. Asterisk, they began with routines. Breakfast together. Short walks around the neighborhood. Conversations about nothing and everything. Daniel noticed how Margaret moved more slowly now, how she paused to catch her breath on the stairs. She noticed the scars he tried not to show, and the way loud noises made his shoulders tense. Neither pushed. Healing, they both understood, required patience. Asterisk word of Daniel's return spread quickly. At first, Margaret worried about the attention. For years, she had grieved quietly, privately. Now neighbors stopped by with disbelief written on their faces. Some cried openly. Others stood in stunned silence, unsure what to say to a man they had mourned. The army arrived soon after. An official ceremony was held at the local base. This time, there was no memorial photograph, no folded flag handed to a shaking mother. Daniel stood in full uniform, alive and present, as his name was restored publicly. His medals were returned not mailed, not boxed away, but pinned to his chest by a commanding officer who looked him in the eye. Asterisk Margaret sat in the front row again. But this time, her tears were different. They were tears of release. Asterisk when the ceremony ended. Daniel walked straight to her and saluted, then hugged her tightly as the room erupted in applause. For years, Margaret had imagined this moment in reverse, standing alone, accepting loss. Now she stood whole. Asterisk healing also meant confronting the past. One afternoon, Daniel asked Margaret to visit the memorial where his name was etched in stone. She hesitated. That place had been both comfort and wound. They went together. Daniel traced his own name with his fingers, standing silently for a long time. I'm sorry you had to come here, he said finally. Asterisk Margaret shook her head. It helped me survive. He nodded, understanding more than words could express. At home, Daniel fixed things that had been broken for years. The loose porch step, the flickering hallway light, the fence that leaned too far to the left. Margaret watched from the doorway, heart full. Every repair felt symbolic, as if he were mending more than wood. Asterisk evenings became their favorite time. They sat on the porch, watching the sky change colors, talking about the future instead of the past. Daniel spoke about staying close, about rebuilding a life that didn't require hiding. Margaret listened, allowing herself to plan again. Asterisk, some nights were harder. Daniel woke from nightmares he didn't always remember. Margaret would hear him pacing and quietly make tea, sitting with him until the shaking stopped. Other nights, Margaret cried without warning, grief rising unexpectedly despite the miracle sitting beside her. Daniel held her then, understanding that healing didn't erase pain, it made space around it. Asterisk slowly, laughter returned to the house. Real laughter. The kind that surprises you by coming out at all. They cooked meals together, argued playfully about old stories, and shared silences that no longer felt heavy. Asterisk, healing wasn't about forgetting what they lost. Asterisk, it was about choosing to live fully with what they had found again. Asterisk, on a warm summer evening, Margaret sat on the same couch where she once folded laundry in silence. Asterisk this time. Daniel sat beside her. Asterisk. You know, she said softly. I always felt you'd come back. Daniel smiled. So did I. Asterisk outside. The porch light glowed, no longer waiting, but welcoming. Ending message. Some heroes are buried in stone. Others walk home. And sometimes, miracles wear combat boots.